Good morning and welcome to the interview series for the Settlement Project. Today it's our great pleasure to have with us Dr. Gordon Anderson. He's a graduate of Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Anderson is an expert in world social systems. He's organized major international conferences, including one on the Soviet Union in Geneva, one on China and in a new era in the Philippines, and the future of liberal democracies in London. He's published several books, especially as related to what we'll be discussing today. Some of his earlier books include Philosophy of the United States, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, as well as the volume Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, version 4.0. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson to our program today. Dr. Anderson, welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Frank.
This is great. We've done this once before on some of your prior work. I believe it may have been on your prior volume, I think.
No, I think it was an article I did, but possibly we did one on this topic of social institutions earlier on.
Yes.
I made a book on it.
Was that part of what evolved into this book that we're going to discuss today?
That's part of it, yes.
Very good. All right, well, I've already introduced you and I've already introduced the book, but let's just real quick do that now again here in case somebody picks up in the middle of our interview here. So the book is entitled Integral Society, Social Institutions, and Individual Sovereignty. It just came out or just days ago or?
It came out as an ebook about 2 weeks ago.
All right.
And the print book will follow next spring.
I see. Okay, so it's only available now in ebook.
Yes.
And it's purchasable by your own
Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble.
Or Amazon.com.
Both places. Okay, wonderful. And just curious, I hadn't planned this, but what would create a different time spacing for the release of an ebook and a print book? Because you said next spring.
Yeah, at this point, I am still collecting data and critiques.
So how would it be the case that an ebook appears much earlier than the print volume?
In this case, I'm using the ebook to gather criticisms and corrections to try to improve it because it costs a lot more money to print the actual print book, and I want to have it the best possible. The ebook, I can revise it and upload, and somebody with a Kindle can get the latest version just by erasing their current version and downloading the new one without any extra cost.
And congratulations, I didn't pay attention close enough to see that it's a Barnes and Noble. Is that the publisher or is it Paragon House Publishers?
Paragon House Publisher, yeah.
Very good, very good. Okay, and so in the tagline, you describe, or in the promotional literature, you describe that it challenges people of our present time to think about fundamental institutional changes needed to defend the sovereignty of individuals. That's the core thrust of the book.
I would say that's a good description. That's John Roth's description from his
praise
endorsement of the book. Yes.
Yeah, very good, very good. In the same promotional literature, I don't know now if I'm quoting again from another scholar praising your work, but it describes that the institutions are meant to serve sovereign individuals, not be exploited by them. And in the same paragraph, you say that while institutions have a valuable place in integral society, they must be kept to their mission, sphere, and level of society. Could you explain in a few words these spheres? This would be helpful.
Yes, this is actually in the appendix of the book, and it builds on Ken Wilber's theory. Ken Wilber published a best-selling book, A Theory of Everything, in which he gives a big picture of the historical evolution of human development and consciousness. And I have added the concept of spheres. He already has levels in his view, but so levels of society would be like individual, family, society, nation, world, cosmos, those different levels. Spheres of society are governance, culture, and economy. And these spheres, I explain, come out of something very related to human nature. It's developed by Friedrich Hayek in his idea of spontaneous social orders. But the idea is communication is the basis of culture. And the idea to produce an exchange is the basis of the economy. And the third is the almost automatic creation of laws. The people, when they get together, they make rules about how they're going to behave. And Hayek argues that all these three things occur whether, I mean, it's like breathing or eating. Those are social aspects of our life is fundamental to social existence, as breathing and eating are to biological existence. So social institutions often try, and these are the basis of the three spheres. Communication would be for culture, economy for the desire to exchange, and rulemaking for governance. So these are the three core spheres of society. And then you have the levels. So institutions fit in one of those spheres and at one of those levels. And the family does not exist at the global level, it's at the family level. And often institutions try to operate at the wrong level. For example, in communism, you have the central government trying to plan people's daily economic lives. And that interferes with this natural desire to produce an exchange that is part of human nature. So anytime a social institution suppresses this one of these natural impulses to communicate, to have fair laws, or to have free exchange of goods and services, then human beings are frustrated by these social institutions. And we see today, we're in a world where social institutions all over the place are trampling on individual sovereignty. And that is you see it when the World Economic Forum is trying to, control what people eat and what kind of food they have and what kind of money they use. You see it all over the hijacking of universities and other institutions in all three spheres. So the idea is that institutions must remain in their proper sphere and at their proper level. And that when they do that and they serve according to their mission, then they're serving human beings rather than exploiting or oppressing them. But the nature of institutions is, you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely is the slogan related to governance. But the same is true of other institutions. Since institutions are human collectives, they have more power and usually more wealth than an individual would. So they can use that to their advantage to either serve or oppress people. And I'm arguing in this book that, especially in the economic sphere, we're still living in feudalistic times where certain people control the money and the new money, and through government and banking cabals, they are really preventing people from having a blessed life.
A lot of questions came up in my mind as you were just describing the overall infrastructure or kind of skeleton on which your writing happens here. One of them is the sphere. You say the spheres were Wilber's concept, and the levels you've added in, or?
Oh, the levels are Wilber's concept, and they're kind of common. You see that in lots of teachings, and you see that in traditional international relations courses. You have what's called the levels of analysis problem. The spheres are my own development.
I see.
And because each of them rely on different principles, and when one institution in one sphere tries to do something in another sphere, it's not properly equipped. For example, government might try to control language. We've recently had problems with censorship in the social media, and we can see that it suppresses that spontaneous nature of people's desire to communicate and seek truth. So it's the wrong sphere for government. Is not the sphere of language, it's culture. And that should be free. Government would serve as a referee, not as a player in the case of language.
Okay, so the spheres are what you've added into the equation in analysis for envisioning a healthy and wholesome
Right.
society.
So Wilber's theory of everything had this real big picture with 4 quadrants and all these different levels of development. The 4 quadrants are individual, internal and external, social, internal and external. So you can place everything related to individuals in those upper 2 quadrants, mind and body, unity, etc. And in the lower 2 quadrants, you have social consciousness or culture, and then the institutions that develop. And that relates to the interpersonal or transpersonal level of human social.
I see.
Social level.
I see. It sounds like you've added some refinement to the levels. I'm hearing basically 2 different levels in what you've just described as Wilber's 4 quadrants. And earlier on, you mentioned several levels, like the individual, the family, the tribe, and so forth.
Yes, Wilber discusses that. He takes the 4 quadrants and he goes from the beginning, like 12,000 years ago, little hunter-gatherer societies, and draws a line out to the present day. We're reaching what he calls an integral commons. That is where we have a consciousness he talks about stage 1 and stage 2, or a tier 1 and tier 2 consciousness. Tier 1 consciousness is self-focused. And we know that when a baby's born, it just thinks about mother's nipple and and the poop on its butt or whatever, and is totally self-focused. And then as we grow and mature, our consciousness develops to where we're able to think about others, how others might feel, come to a view, what some Christians would call God's point of view, where you would see everyone as God's child. And so the second tier consciousness gets to that level where you're totally transcending your own ego in a higher view of consciousness. So Wilber argues in his political side that the US founding fathers were nearing this type of integral consciousness. Yeah, so Wilber has this view of both the levels and the quadrants.
I see.
And I added the spheres.
So with the spheres, would it be the case that every level would have all 3 spheres in it?
Yes. So in the family, the economy, the culture, and the rules are given by the parents to the children. They manage that on their level. And they have should have a certain natural amount of responsibility on all 3 spheres.
Yes.
You shouldn't have ask a government to do for a family what a family can do for itself, which is the principle of subsidiarity, which in relation to levels, this is a Catholic doctrine, but I use it in the book. In relation to levels, you give the greatest responsibility to the lowest possible level, because that leads to the highest amount of fulfillment and the least amount of oppression.
Very good. A few more questions naturally arising from your explanation so far. One of them very quickly is that you created a sphere of culture that arises out of is the domain of communication. Yes.
Yes. Well, culture is it relates to knowledge, education, but it comes out of this natural desire. When you talk about social interaction between human beings, there's a natural desire to communicate.
Okay.
People, I'm out in the woods and I run into somebody. I want to communicate with them.
Yes. And
so language develops from that.
Language develops from that, and culture develops from languages.
Yes, and knowledge develops in pursuit of truth. Each one of these spheres has an appropriate commandment. The cultural sphere would be "Thou shalt not lie," because if you lie, then communication doesn't properly take place. And "Thou shalt not steal" in the economic sphere, because everybody has the desire to produce and exchange, and if somebody takes their stuff, they rob them of that capacity. And "Thou shalt not kill" is obvious, the right to life. You can't even live and pursue happiness if you have no life.
And you would place the killing as related to the governance sphere?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, what I wanted to ask about is that each of these spheres will have a content dimension as well as a process dimension. So it would seem to me that communication is only just addressing the process dimension, whereas the content dimension in the cultural sphere is is information. It's actually a commodity. And lying relates more to the verity of the content. I guess it does use some process. You can become a skilled liar. That means you have communication powers. But the main thing you're doing is misrepresenting the facts of the matter. They're not quite static, but you might, for argument's sake, it's a static entity. It's like the coin of that realm.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. There is a process and a content dimension. The content is the knowledge or the understanding. And if you create false knowledge or fake news, you're kind of committing fraud. Now, fraud is a crime. That's something the government should regulate, because government should not control the content or generate the words, but it should be a referee in the enabling the free exchange of information.
And the means by which the determination of or misrepresentation of the facts of the matter, that would fall to what means or authority, or where would government should just referee that communication freely transpires. That's like,
Yeah, so government would come in if somebody claims they've been harmed by fraud, and then there would be go to court, and if it's proven that somebody was injured by fraud, then the government would step in. But the government would not create any of the language to start out with. It's on the back end, not the front end of the exchange.
It's on the back end.
Right.
So that the government has no say in what anyone chooses to represent.
No, the government is not the appropriate instrument for truth, because government is based on power and law. And that tries to create truth that supports power.
Yeah.
And that's always been a problem. The government always try to propagandize. And that has to be prevented. That's why they need to be kept to the limited role of referee.
On the back end.
On the back end, if somebody's harmed, the government should prevent that harm. So, I mean, it can have a kind of a front end effect by having the law that tells somebody if you commit fraud, you're going to go to jail. And that's a deterrent aspect, but it has nothing to do with the content of the communication.
Yeah. It's somewhat of an idealistic formula, but it's fraught with very great difficulties. Correct. If someone says a drug would be helpful in the prevention or cure of a disease, and it proves to be not the case, is that person harmed to the extent that the government is punishing fraud? Or these are the types of things we're facing in our day-to-day lives now.
Yes, I think, you have to come in, and that's why you have the judge side of the government. You have three parts of government. You have the legislation, the law creation, you have the administration, and you have the judges to settle disputes. And often why you have a jury of peers is because the jury has some amount of compassion and some general representation of the whole effect on society, and has to make a judgment. The idea that any of these things can be clear, I think, is a fiction that a lot of people have, that you can have some absolute law that applies in every case. I think that's a fiction that a lot of people who do not have an integral consciousness kind of hold. It's a pre-integral disposition.
Correct. So integral adds in the kind of supple or fluid or flexible elements of everything that has to come under consideration for a healthy society.
Right. Yeah,
Whereas, sorry, people that imagine that there's something technically known as misinformation or disinformation, is somewhat of a mechanistic sense of what is the nature of what's true or what's false.
or mechanistic or reductionistic. So for example, you have the question of climate change. Well, if everything you do is based around some dogmatic notion of climate change, and it doesn't matter if people die because you're so concerned with your climate change policy, maybe genocide becomes then a
Praised.
appropriate action in your reductionistic mindset. It's not
So-
integral. An integral would view the value of every human life. It has intrinsic value. According to Kant's categorical imperative, that treat everybody as an end in themselves, not as a means to some other end.
Very good. The other thing, so in the other spheres, in the sphere of governance and in the sphere of commerce, there are these paired elements. There is the content. So even in governance, the content is the mechanism of power, of the mechanism of enforcement. And then there's the process, which should govern or guide that particular content of that sphere.
Yeah, you can view the process as like the operating system. You have a constitution, a set of laws. In a computer, you have an operating system that tells everything how it's going to, all the components, how they're going to communicate with all the other components to facilitate the job of word processing or whatever you want to do. And the same thing, the government law and the legislative process is dictated by the Constitution, but the actual content of the law is determined as it arises in the course of human events.
So, and finally, the same with commerce, or what you call enterprise. What was that sphere you call it?
The economic sphere.
Economic sphere.
Economic sphere is actually the most serious sphere that I address in the book, because in the evolution of the cultural sphere, we had come to a level of individually autonomy with the teaching of Martin Luther and other Reformation principles that took control of knowledge away from the institution of the church or other social institutions, or it took it out of the realm of both the government and cultural institutions. So people gained individual cultural autonomy, which was a foundation for democracy in the political sphere. In the political sphere, you have you can't really have democracy without self-sufficient, self-reliant individuals.
Okay.
But in the economic sphere, we still suffer from feudalism. And this stems back to banking practices begun in 1696 in England, where the bank fractional reserve banking creates what's called new money. I don't know if you understand that process, but say if you have $100,000 and you put in a savings account, fractional reserve banking allows the bank to lend out $1 million and hold your 100,000 as a reserve. So because enough people have savings that only so many are, going to the bank and asking for their money at one time. So this mechanism of fractional reserve banking has led to great economic growth. But the payments on that loan, which are backed by your $100,000, are taken by the bank. You should get the $1 million when the loan is paid, and the bank should be charged a service fee. And that's the way it was before.
When did that change?
1696. And here's what happened. It was illegal to do it because the banks were really stealing the depositors' money, or the banks were working off of were using the depositors' money to take the profit rather than giving the profit to the depositor and charging a service fee. But in 1696, the government says, hey, we're going to ignore that if you give us part of the reward. So this taxpayers paying, the depositors paying $100,000, instead of, we're not going to let you take $1 million and just take it and steal it from the depositor, but we'll let it slide if you give us a certain amount. So there's been these government and bank cabals where this new money is divided up between the bankers and the governments. And it's often used to fund military industrial complex, or in the case of England, King William used it to fight wars when the system went into effect. And so the real question about fractional reserve banking is who gets the money. And if the depositors got it, the capital would be distributed throughout the whole society. And you would have everybody owning the capital, which funds all the industrial production and growth that we have, instead of the 1% or 3%. So we have a system now in which the governments and the bank take the 1%. And you had Marx arguing against that, but he wanted the party to take the 1%. Whereas I am arguing that the true economic democracy is this money is given equal opportunity among all citizens. And that would be the third, the evolution of sovereignty or economic autonomy in the third sphere. So we have autonomy in the cultural sphere and the government sphere. We at least have glimpses of it. And in the US founding, we have a particular good glimpse at it. Because at the US founding, I want to introduce one more principle related to the economics, and that is what's called binary economics. Everybody has labor. We have our labor value, right? We can work so much, we put in 8 hours a day, we get paid for it. It might be the banker shuffling papers, or it might be a ditch digger digging ditches, but you're getting paid for your labor. And when the United States was founded, almost everybody was paid for their labor, because almost everybody had their own business or their own farm. And there's very little developed by capital. I explained that about 95% of production came from labor at the time of the US founding. So you had economic democracy. But the development of capital and machines, and now today artificial intelligence and robots, you have production generated from capital rather than human labor. So we have this problem where today, instead of 95% of production coming from our labor, we have 95% of our production coming from capital.
Really?
But only 1% of the population receives this, or 3% receives most of this because of the way this money is distributed, this new fractional reserve banking money. Almost 97% of the new money ends up in the hands of just a few people. Whereas if it was illegal for the banks to take the depositors' money, but the banks had to pay the depositors the payments on this, then everybody in the country could be a depositor and everybody could be an ownership of the means of production, because they would receive the payments on the capital investments that the banks receive today. And the banks are receiving those payments on your money. That's not even legitimate enterprise, but it's been going on so long that even bankers just assume it as the normal practice, even though it's highly unethical and unjust.
So I have hundreds of questions. I hope I'm planning, or I hope you will have time going forward that we can take up little sections of your book further. But very quickly, the fact that capital rather than labor is producing, would you call it wealth, or is
It's the basis of wealth. Yeah, right. It's the basis of all the wealth produced from machines and
okay?
or artificial intelligence, robots, all the things that instead of individual labor, things are being produced in other ways.
So, and you would say that capital is generating that value, that wealth, that growth, economic growth. So you've mentioned two elements in banking that define or have a strong influence, or maybe even define the current economic reality we face today. One was fractional reserve banking, which it was developed where, please?
Well, it was developed in Sweden, but bankers have always been trying to use other people's money to profit on them. And if they could dip into reserves, they would try to get away with it. But it became legal in Sweden to hold a 10% reserve. And then banks could lend out the rest, because not everybody would be running on the bank for money at the same time. And that allowed it allows the economy to expand very rapidly compared to waiting for somebody to mine gold and have everything tied. All the rest of the economy can only grow as fast as gold is mined or something.
Understood. Okay. And then the other thing is, you mentioned what's called binary. Was it binary economics or binary banking, or what was that?
Binary economics. It's when you get an income from both labor and capital. Now, everybody pretty much gets an income from their labor and their salary or their paycheck. But income from capital would be extra money that comes from lending to corporations who are building and then receiving the payments back on that. And all that new capital is developed. I think in 2019, the US developed $4 trillion in new capital that added to the economy. And so just a few people got that. Whereas if that were spread out among the entire population, it'd be $10,000 per person.
Okay. I always thought that capital's capacity to produce wealth or value or wealth came from just the money itself. But we were discussing earlier, possibly before this interview, that you even include the money produced by AI, by robots, by machines. That's capital producing value.
Yes, it takes capital to buy the machines. You couldn't set up a Tesla factory without capital. you just wouldn't have a bunch of people getting together with manual labor. And you need, and the industrial sector has evolved over time. So you would buy big machines from other companies, and then you would typically borrow money from a bank. And the bank would, as I mentioned before, be using your $100,000, getting $1 million back on a 5-year loan at 8%. And they give you like 0.1% on that today, but you should be getting about a 200% return on that.
Understood. Okay, so there's two things producing genuine increase in wealth and value. But the problem is not that capital produces value. That's not the problem. Or even that fractional reserve banking is a way to heat up the economy or create growth. That's not a problem either. The problem is the way things are structured in a corrupt fashion that only a tiny few people sees all of the value that's produced. Is that what you're?
That's right. So only it's like just a few percent of the population own 90-some% of the capital, and receive 90% of the and you know, you get income just from production and selling things. You can have a profit, but and that goes to the stockholders, or in our corrupt system, a lot of it goes to the government. But you have income from lending, and you have income from stock ownership. And you know, the concern about Marx is the workers didn't own the means of production. Well, I'm arguing that observation is correct, that everybody should own the means of production. Everybody should have the opportunity to invest in all the companies and receive both the proceeds from the loans that those companies take, and as well as income on stock dividends. And you would have everybody in the country largely be in the middle class, just like when the US was founded, you had an economic democracy because everybody's income was from labor. What I'm proposing is a system in which everybody's income is from labor and capital. And you don't have a situation like where Warren Buffett pays 10% on his income and the secretary pays 40% on hers, because hers is labor and his is capital. You should be charging the same taxes on capital income as labor income.
Real quickly, of course, Marx's experiment resulted in the darkest period of human affairs, mass genocide, the worst ever. What do you envision in terms of the equalization that you're advocating that would travel a different path than what happened to the Marx?
Marx wanted to totally centralize ownership of capital, and even make it less than the owners, just the leaders of the party that controlled it. Whereas, and the government sphere is not even the right sphere. It's not part of the economic sphere. So the principles aren't even right for making an economy work. What I'm proposing is distribution of ownership of capital. But
wasn't he saying, right, that everyone owns the means of production? Wasn't that his slogan?
I would think that he would be happy with that outcome, but that never happened. And it's not clear from the Communist Manifesto that he really wanted all the workers to own the means of production but that the party would intervene on the workers' behalf because they weren't smart enough to manage it themselves. And that's certainly the way Lenin went. And that's the way the World Economic Forum is going today.
But the World Economic Forum makes no pretense of wanting mass distribution of the means of production. And
No, and neither did Marx, because Marx actually talked about, at least the Marxists, the Communist Party today, defines private property as distinct as from what you own, your house or your car or your bed, but private property is a special means of, it's the capital ownership for the means of production.
and what, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so he said that he made people, in his rhetoric, he made people believe that the workers should own the means of production, but then he turns around and says, give it to the party who will act on the workers' behalf. And that's the mistake. So really, the workers should own the means of production. Not only the workers, but anyone who's involved in because Marx just had a labor theory of value. He didn't have binary economics. He didn't have a capital theory of value.
Very good. Who would guarantee that the distribution would meet this idealistic concept that you're putting forward? Because what we would have to do would be avoid something like the party, which became a totalitarian tyranny.
Yes, so there's two proposals I have in my book, and one of them is just natural. You have nobody overseeing it. You just have people investing in savings accounts, and the actual capital produced from those savings is given back to the depositors. So if you have $100,000 in your bank, you might have $1 million after 5 years.
It's just structuring
the amount the banker would have. The banker would get $1 million on your money on a 5-year loan at 8% to a corporation. But that is not their money. They're guaranteeing it with your deposit. So that would distribute, everybody can have a savings account. And if everybody's making 200, it'd be 30% on a 30-year mortgage on a house and 200% on a 8% 5-year industrial loan. It depends on the type of loan. But, people would all be highly motivated to save and prosper greatly from their savings rather than just a few percent taking it all and using it for also unworthy purposes like military wars.
Would there need to be any somehow renaissance of human nature involved, or you imagine that this could be just managed in
No, it would just happen in this system. It would just happen spontaneously because of the spontaneous nature of the desire of human beings to exchange, as long as you keep it in the economic sphere. Now there are proposals, and some of them are pretty good, where this new money would get divided into capital homestead accounts. So everybody at birth would get a capital homestead account. And then the banks, you'd need something like some entity like the Federal Reserve to deposit those monies equally in everybody's capital homestead account. That would be really giving everybody exactly the same, but that would eliminate the motives for savings because everybody would automatically get it. So you could argue that it would be more just, but I don't think it would be as economically efficient as the normal market.
Another part of our prior conversations had to do with your sense of timing or historical timing, because in a certain way, perhaps, well, I speak for myself. I was going to say the hearer or the listener of our show, but there's there I've there seems an idealism in what you're recommending. It's hard for me to envision the mere manipulation of systems that could utterly ignore the dysfunctional or dark side of human behavior, greed, lust, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so,
So you need checks and balances to prevent that. So in the Constitution that I propose, no government could borrow money from a central bank in which it controls the currency. You can only borrow from some other entity, not from a cabal. And so that would greatly limit the government's ability to collude in this and backhandedly sanction the banks stealing it, because they say, okay, well, you can steal it, but give me a kickback. That's basically the system we have today. So the Constitution would forbid that.
in a way, just simply a hard separation of the two, making the two non-collaborative at the expense
Yeah,
of the citizen.
it's the same way today. A state, individual state, can't print money. So an individual state can't do this. And an individual state isn't part of the cabal. It's only the federal government, the Federal Reserve, in the case of the United States, or the European Central Bank or the Bank of England, that are involved in these corrupt cabals. Bank of China, where the Communist Party does the same thing. So yeah, it's mainly a separation of powers. They would be unable to do it. Government would be unable to do it, and the banks would be forced. They would be punished if they didn't pay the payments that came from this new capital, if it didn't go back to the depositors. But if they kept it, they'd try to keep it, of course. But if they receive stiff enough penalties for not distributing these funds, and in my example of $100,000 deposit and $1 million coming back in payments, the interest at 8% on that would be about $194,000. Now that's no small amount. That's plenty for a bank to push papers and have its own labor income. I mean, the banks wouldn't suffer any more than the average person. They would be getting plenty for their labor income.
Very good. Well, there's a lot more I want to ask. I had a lot of questions based on one of the beauty of your book is that you make things very clear. You outline, I'm going to speak about these things. The book is divided into these parts. You explain the parts. You have a constitution, which you've proposed. And so I have a lot of questions. We've concentrated mainly on the issue of banking and the kind of grand theft from the citizenry. But there's much more to discuss. Just before you go, you mentioned to me that your sense that this is a time in history that something revolutionary or something a great leap could happen. Could you mention a word on that?
Well, you do see all over the world. You see the tremendous inflation because the banks have like taken this cabal to almost the limit. They can hardly sustain it anymore. So you're seeing possibilities of economic collapse. You're seeing possibilities of rigged elections. You're seeing all kinds of complaints about individuals complaining against social institutions. And And that's happening all over in all kind, whether it be social media institutions or whatever, but people are starting to realize that we don't have the controls on social institutions that are needed. They've evolved since our constitutions were developed 300 years ago. Now, we didn't have any corporations in the United States. We outlawed the Hudson's Bay Company and the East India Company and started from scratch, mainly with labor power and family businesses.
So you, in a way, you're suggesting that the level of corruption or the level of dysfunction has reached almost an insufferable limit, that change is being forced. There's no further to go in the dysfunction of what has evolved institutionally.
Well, you're seeing people waking up. They're talking about this time as even a second Great Awakening. And you had the Great Awakening in the 1730s before the original US Revolution, but Donald Trump, the nationalist movements, the Brazilian election, all of these things are protests against the World Economic Forum and the vaccines and government mandates. People are just getting fed up with what institutions are doing to them.
Good. Okay. In our next conversation, I'd like to talk about these levels that you introduced in the beginning of our interview here. And my question will be, I'm going to wrap up now, but my question will be, can a dysfunction or oppression or kind of a tyrannical control be from just one level up? Or do you leap across to federal control way down of the family? That kind of thing I'd like to look at next time we're together.
Yeah, that's an important point. And there are examples of skipping levels.
Yeah, I think this will be an important thing to look at when we're together next. It's been a great chance to be together again, Dr. Anderson. I always enjoy listening to your understanding.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very
It's
much.
been a pleasure.
See you soon.
Okay.